Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Tragedy, Triumph, and True Crime Tales, a channel for people who like drifting off to light stories about dark topics. Tonight's story takes us all the way back to the Victorian age, so get comfortable and settle in as we begin. Chicago, May 1st, 1893. The gates open at 9 in the morning, and the crowd has been waiting since before dawn. They have come from every state in the Union, by train, by wagon, by steamship. Some of them have spent money they could not afford. They are here because they were told, and they believed it, that what waited on the other side of these gates was the future. They were not wrong. The World's Columbian Exposition, 690 acres on the shore of Lake Michigan, painted entirely white, blazing at night with 200,000 electric lights. A Ferris wheel 264 feet tall. A telephone that lets you hear the New York Metropolitan Opera from the edge of a Chicago lake. 27 million people will pass through these gates before October. Nearly half the country will come here. They are looking at wonder. They are not looking at the hotel. 1 mile from the fairgrounds, on the corner of 63rd and Wallace, stands a 3-story building with a pharmacy on the ground floor. Its owner is a young doctor named Henry Howard Holmes. Charming, handsome, the kind of man who makes you feel, in the first few minutes of conversation, that he has always been on your side. He has been building this hotel for 2 years. He went through more than a dozen contractors, dismissing each before they could understand the full design. Some noticed things that confused them: rooms with no windows, corridors that ended in walls, a chute running from the second floor directly into the basement. They asked. Holmes had an answer for everything. Several of the workers were never paid. A handful were never seen again. This is the story of Herman Webster Mudgett, the man who looked at a city blinded by wonder and understood that spectacle is the perfect cover for darkness. For years, no one looked. This is what they missed. He was born in Gilmanton, New Hampshire on May 16, 1861, the third of 5 children in a strict Methodist household. His father, Levi, was cold and disciplinarian, a man who believed that the fear of God and the fear of him were interchangeable. His mother, Theodate, was warmer, more present. From an early age, Herman Mudgett was the most intelligent person in any room he walked into. His teachers noticed it, his neighbors noticed it, and he noticed them noticing it. Gilmanton was a small town, the kind of place where families knew each other's histories back 3 generations, and where reputation was built slowly and lost fast. Herman's reputation was complicated from early on. There are accounts, consistent across multiple sources, of cruelty to animals in his childhood. Not dramatic cruelty, the small, quiet kind. The kind a community notices, but does not name. And there is a story that appears in the historical record often enough to be worth examining. A group of schoolmates, knowing that Herman feared the local doctor's office, and specifically the skeleton that hung inside it, forced him inside and held his hands against the bones. The story goes that instead of leaving more frightened, something shifted in that room. That after that day, he was no longer afraid of it. That he became, if anything, fascinated. We cannot know with certainty what happened. What we know is that by the time he left New Hampshire for university, he had already developed an unusual relationship with the human body, not as something sacred or even sentimental, but as a mechanism, a thing to be understood, perhaps already a thing to be used. He studied first at the University of Vermont, then at the University of Michigan Medical School in Ann Arbor, from which he graduated in 1884. He was, by all faculty accounts, an exceptional student, meticulous, capable of long hours of focused work that most of his classmates struggled to match. Ann Arbor in the early 1880s was a place where the new sciences were arriving quickly, where dissection and anatomy were becoming accepted medical practice, and where the bodies needed for that work were in chronic short supply. Anatomy schools across 19th century America faced a persistent problem. They needed cadavers. The law permitted the use of executed criminals and unclaimed bodies from poorhouses. But there were never enough. A trade had grown up around the shortage, body snatchers, called resurrection men, who robbed graves and sold what they found to medical schools. It was illegal. It was widespread. Everyone in medicine knew about it, and most looked the other way. Hermann Mudgett did not merely look the other way. He improved upon the model. He would obtain a cadaver, take out a life insurance policy on it under a false identity, stage an accident, and collect the payout. His victims were already dead. But he was learning something important: the logic of the body as commodity and the power of the false claim. Both lessons would serve him for the rest of his life. He graduated in 1884 and disappeared into the country. A highly educated man with a talent for deception and no functioning conscience, looking for a larger stage. Before we follow him to Chicago, we need to stop and meet two women, because the story of H. Holmes did not begin in Chicago. It began in a pattern, and the pattern had already been running for years. Clara Levering was his first wife, from Alton, New Hampshire. They married in 1878 when Herman was 17. She bore his child. He drifted away from her without drama, as he would do throughout his life, moving toward the next opportunity and leaving the previous life intact behind him, like a shed skin. Clara never divorced him. She went on, as people do, without ever fully understanding what had happened. Myrta Belknap was the second. He married her in Minneapolis in 1887, while still legally married to Clara. He moved with her to Chicago, kept her comfortable in a suburb north of the city, and kept her separate from the life he was building on the south side. She bore him a daughter, Lucy. She believed, as wives do, that she knew who she had married. She did not. No one did. In Englewood, on Chicago's south side, he presented himself as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes and took a job at the pharmacy of a Mrs. Elizabeth Holton, whose husband was gravely ill. He was exactly what the pharmacy needed: qualified, charming, apparently good with the business side of things. Within months, Dr. Holton was dead. Within a year, Mrs. Holton had disappeared. Holmes told customers she had moved to California. The paperwork transferring the pharmacy to him was all in order, he said. No one investigated. In Englewood in 1887, there was no reason to. He used the pharmacy's profits to purchase the vacant lot across the street, and he began to build. Chicago in 1886 was a city in a hurry. 15 years earlier, the Great Fire of 1871 had consumed 3.5 square miles in 2 days, killing hundreds and leaving 100,000 people homeless. Chicago had not merely rebuilt, it had reimagined itself. The architects who came to design the new Chicago invented the modern skyscraper. The railroads had made it the hub of the continent. The stockyards had made it the meatpacking capital of the world. It was a city of immigrants and ambition and noise, a place where no one knew your name unless you told them. It was exactly the right city for Herman Mudgett. He hired contractors in rotation, never the same crew long enough to understand the full design. When workers asked about the unusual features, Holmes gave plausible explanations or dismissed them from the job. He owed, by the end of construction, enormous sums to suppliers and tradesmen across Chicago. He paid almost none of it. When creditors came looking, he claimed the work was defective, or that the contractor had cheated him, or simply that the money had run out. What they built, partly unwittingly, was unlike any building in America. The first floor held the pharmacy and various commercial spaces Holmes rented out to tenants. The upper floors were the hotel, 100 rooms or more, with a rooftop garden that guests were welcome to use in the evenings. It looked, from the street, entirely normal, welcoming even. But between and behind and beneath those rooms was a different architecture entirely. There were rooms with no windows and no ventilation, accessible only from the outside of their walls, rooms that could be sealed from the corridor. There were doorways that opened onto blank walls, and passages between rooms that had no logical purpose. There was a chute, wide enough for a person, running from the second floor directly to the basement, and in the basement, a kiln approximately 5 feet in diameter, capable of reaching temperatures high enough to incinerate bone, a dissection table, its surface designed to drain, vats large enough to hold a human body, one containing acid, one lime, barrels, shelves of surgical instruments arranged with the kind of care a doctor brings to a well-organized office. Holmes had also routed gas lines into individual guest rooms. The supply was controlled not from within the rooms, but from a valve system in his private office on the second floor. He could, from his desk, fill a sealed room with gas while its occupant slept. The occupant would have no warning and no way out. The building was completed in time for the World's Fair. May 1893. The gates open and the city fills. Holmes's hotel begins taking guests. His particular interest was in young women traveling alone, and in 1893, the fair had created thousands of them. Women from across the country making their first independent journey, excited and inexperienced, and, in many cases, exactly what Holmes was looking for. People with no local connections, whose absence would not immediately trigger a search. He was charming to all of them. He had a gift, documented by everyone who encountered him, for making a person feel immediately understood, as though he had seen something true about them that no one else had noticed. We do not know with certainty how many people H. Holmes killed. The confirmed number, established through forensic evidence and legal proceedings, is at minimum 9. Holmes himself claimed 27. The bones found in his building could not all be identified. What we can do is meet the people we know about, not as victims, as people. Julia Connor was 30 years old when she entered Holmes's life in 1891. She had come to Chicago with her husband, Ned, and their 8-year-old daughter, Pearl. Ned took a job in Holmes's building. Holmes began an affair with Julia shortly after. When Ned discovered it and left, Julia stayed. She worked for Holmes, lived in the building, and trusted him completely. Pearl had brown hair and, by Julia's own written account, a habit of collecting small flat stones from the road and keeping them in her coat pockets. Julia disappeared around Christmas 1891. Pearl disappeared the same day. Pearl Connor was 8 years old. Emmeline Sigrande was 18 and came from Indiana, the daughter of a German immigrant family. She came to work for Holmes as a stenographer in 1892, saving money to help her younger siblings through school. Her family described her as methodical, responsible, and quietly funny, a person who wrote long letters home every week and who had, according to her mother, a voice that carried across a room when she laughed. She disappeared in December 1892. Her family never stopped looking. Minnie Williams was 25 and came from a prosperous Texas family. She had inherited land in Fort Worth from her parents, who had died when she was young. Holmes charmed her completely. She transferred the Texas property to him within months of their meeting. She brought her younger sister Nanny to Chicago to visit. Nanny was 23. Both sisters disappeared in the summer of 1893. The land, worth roughly $50,000 in 1893 currency, had already been sold. And then there was Benjamin Petezel, 35, Holmes's occasional business partner. Petezel had a wife, Carrie, and 5 children: Desi, Alice, Nellie, Howard, and the baby Wharton. Holmes insured Petezel's life for $10,000, then killed him rather than faking his death as they had originally planned. He told Carrie that her husband was alive and hiding, and persuaded her to let him take 3 of her children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, to join their father. He took them. He killed them on the road. Alice Petezel was 15. Nellie was 11. Howard was 8. Carrie Petezel survived. She spent months believing her children were on their way to safety. She died in 1917, having outlived Holmes by 21 years, carrying the knowledge of what had been done to her family for the rest of her life. The thread that unraveled everything was not the castle, it was the insurance company. In late 1894, the Fidelity Mutual Life Insurance Company of Philadelphia was reviewing the $10,000 claim filed on the life of Benjamin Petezel. The amount was significant. The circumstances were unusual. They hired the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to look more closely. The detective assigned was Frank Geyer, a 20-year veteran of the Philadelphia police before joining the Pinkertons. He was methodical, patient. He had the particular gift that all great investigators share: the willingness to follow a thread even when the answers he received were plausible, and even when following it was slow and difficult, and led somewhere he had not expected. Holmes was already in custody in Boston at this point, arrested for horse theft, a petty crime he had committed almost casually, as though he could not stop accumulating frauds even as a larger investigation began closing around him. While he sat in a Philadelphia jail awaiting further charges, charming his guards and writing letters to anyone who might help him, Geyer set out to trace the 3 missing Petezel children. He interviewed Carrie Petezel, who had last seen Alice, Nellie, and Howard in the autumn. Holmes had told her they were on their way to their father in London. Carrie had believed him. She had no reason not to. Geyer interviewed Holmes himself, who was cooperative and charming, and had an explanation for everything as always. Geyer listened. He was not convinced. He began to trace the route Holmes had taken with the children, city by city, state by state, crossing into Canada. Hotel receipts, landlord testimonies, the particular memory of a woman in Toronto who recalled a pleasant man with 3 quiet children who had rented a house for a short while before moving on. In Toronto, Geyer found that house. He searched it. In the cellar beneath the floor, he found Alice and Nellie Petezel. They had been placed in a trunk and asphyxiated. The trunk had been buried in the dirt floor. Holmes had moved on the same day he put them there. He found Howard in Indianapolis. Holmes had burned the body. Geyer later wrote a full account of the investigation, a book called The Holmes Petezel Case, published in 1896. It is a careful, professional document. But there is a passage where he describes opening that Toronto cellar, and the composure that investigators are supposed to maintain simply leaves him for a moment. He closes the chapter quickly and moves on. But the moment is there, and it is worth knowing about. Investigators turned then to the hotel in Chicago. The search began in July 1895. On the second floor, behind a false wall that appeared to be a sealed corridor, investigators found a room fitted with a gas inlet pipe, routed through the wall and back to a valve in Holmes's private office. The room had no windows, its door locked from the outside. There was no way for an occupant to open it from within. In the basement, the dissection table, its surface stained in ways consistent with organic material. Surgical instruments laid out with methodical care. 2 large vats, one containing acid, one lime, and the kiln. From the kiln, investigators recovered fragments, bone shards, some identifiable as human, some too fragmented to determine, the specific fragments of a human ankle joint, teeth, watch crystals, glass from pocket watches, which survive extreme heat when organic material does not. Buttons, a small chain that appeared to come from a child's necklace. From a pit dug into the basement floor, investigators recovered a human female skeleton. Later analysis, limited by the standards of 1895, suggested it was consistent with a woman in her 20s or 30s. No identification was conclusively made. The investigators worked without the tools we now take for granted. No DNA analysis, no chemical mass spectrometry, no digital databases of missing persons to cross-reference. They had physical observation, the testimony of former employees and tenants, and the slow, grinding work of matching names to dates, to receipts, to disappearances. What they concluded after several days of methodical search was this: the building had been designed from the beginning as a place where people could be killed and the evidence of their deaths disposed of completely. Not a building where murders happen to occur, a building purpose-built for the act. It was, the newspapers of the day immediately understood, the first structure of its kind ever discovered in the United States. They called it the Murder Castle. The name has lasted because there is no better one. While he awaited execution, Holmes entered into negotiations with the Hearst newspaper syndicate and sold them a confession for $10,000, almost exactly the sum of the Petezel insurance policy. In it, he claimed 27 murders. He named victims, described methods, provided locations. Some of his claims were verified by investigators. Others named people later found alive. He contradicted himself, changed details, added names, and removed them. Scholars who have studied the confession agree that it is not a reliable document, it is a performance. Holmes was, to the end, a man who understood audiences, but it also contains passages too specific to dismiss, details that a man simply inventing a story would not have known. What drove him? Modern forensic psychologists reviewing his case identify the pattern as consistent with what we now call primary psychopathy, a constitutional absence of empathy, combined with high intelligence, superficial charm, and a complete orientation toward self interest. He did not experience guilt, he experienced inconvenience. Other people were resources, to be used, and when the time came, disposed of. He understood this about himself on some level. In one passage of his confession, he describes watching his own behavior from a slight distance, as though it belongs to someone else. He notes, almost academically, that he seems to have been born this way. He may have been right. We still do not fully understand what makes a mind like his. Holmes was tried in Philadelphia in October 1895 on a single charge, the murder of Benjamin Petezel. The jury deliberated for 2 hours and 50 minutes and returned a verdict of guilty. He was sentenced to death. He did not appear at sentencing to feel very much about it. The hanging took place at Moyamensing Prison on the morning of May 7th, 1896. He was 34 years old. He made one unusual request, that his casket be filled with cement and buried 10 feet deep. He said he feared body snatchers, the same trade he had once practiced himself. Whether that was a final dark joke or a genuine fear, no one could say. And for the next 100 years, a quiet question persisted. Had Holmes, who had spent his entire adult life manufacturing false deaths for insurance purposes, managed one last fraud? Was it actually him in that grave? In 2017, Holmes's great-great-grandchildren petitioned a Pennsylvania court for permission to exhume the body. The court agreed. The coffin, encased in concrete as Holmes had requested, had preserved the remains unusually well. The forensic process used to identify them is worth understanding. DNA identification of remains over a century old works through mitochondrial DNA analysis. Unlike nuclear DNA, your unique genetic signature, which degrades quickly in buried remains. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively through the maternal line and survives far longer. A tooth or dense bone from a skeleton buried for 120 years can still yield a usable profile. Investigators extracted mitochondrial DNA from the remains and compared it against a living maternal line descendant of Holmes's mother, Theodate Price Mudgett. The profiles matched. The remains in the concrete coffin in Holy Cross Cemetery are those of Herman Webster Mudgett. H. Holmes did not escape. He was hanged on May 7th, 1896, and he stayed dead. The question was answered 121 years later by a science that did not exist when he was alive. The building at 63rd and Wallace caught fire in August 1895. While the investigation was still ongoing, it caught fire again in 1896. What remained was eventually demolished in 1938. Today, a United States post office occupies the site. An ordinary building on an ordinary corner in what is now the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago. There is no marker, no plaque, nothing on the exterior to indicate what stood there or what happened inside it. In one sense, that seems wrong. In another, it seems right. The people who died in that building were not served by the infamy of the address. They were served, insofar as anything could serve them, by being remembered as people, which is what we have tried to do here. We will never know the full number of his victims. The confirmed count, supported by physical evidence and legal proceedings, is 9. Holmes claimed 27 in his newspaper confession. Some researchers, accounting for people who disappeared from his orbit and were never found or identified, believe the true number was higher still. We cannot know. He was systematic about destruction, and the forensics of 1895 could not recover what he had deliberately erased. What we know is that Julia Connor was real. Pearl Connor was real, 8 years old, keeping flat stones in her coat pockets. Emmeline Sigrande was real, sending long letters home from Chicago every week, saving money for her siblings' schooling. Minnie Williams was real. Nanny Williams was real. Benjamin Pittezel was real. And Alice and Nellie and Howard Pittezel were real. On a train moving through the American Midwest, heading toward a father they would never reach, with a man they had been told to trust. Carrie Pittezel lost her husband and 3 of her 5 children in a single year. She was 32 years old when it began. She outlived Holmes by 21 years, dying in 1917, having lived with the full weight of what had been done to her family for the rest of her life. Her 2 surviving children, Desi and the baby Wharton, grew up in the knowledge of it. Herman Webster Mudgett is, in the most precise historical sense, the first person in the United States to be described and prosecuted in the way we would now recognize as a serial killer case. The term itself did not exist until the 1970s, when FBI agent Robert Ressler developed it as part of a broader project to classify and understand exactly this category of criminal. But the case of H. Holmes forced American law enforcement, for the first time, to confront a person who killed not from passion, not from desperation, not from a single catastrophic failure of self-control, but methodically, repeatedly, over years as a matter of habit and preference. A person who understood, before anyone in law enforcement did, exactly how to hide in plain sight. The search of the murder castle established for the first time the principle that a building itself could be a crime scene, that the architecture of a space could constitute evidence of premeditation. That idea is now foundational to forensic investigation. The work of Frank Geyer, following the paper trail of a criminal across a continent, city by city, receipt by receipt, door by door, established the model for investigative procedure. He did not have databases or digital records or DNA. He had patience and method, and the refusal to stop asking questions when the answers he received were plausible but not quite right. These things mattered then. They are still taught now. And then there is the question that Frank Geyer himself never fully answered in his book. The question that everyone who studies this case eventually arrives at. How did this go on for so long? How did a man build a hotel specifically designed to kill people in the middle of a major American city and not be caught for nearly a decade? Part of the answer is the city itself. Chicago in the 1890s was a place of extraordinary churn, people arriving constantly, identities easily reinvented, the machinery of record keeping not yet sophisticated enough to track who came and who went. Part of the answer is the fair. 27 million visitors created a flow of strangers through the city that made individual disappearances almost invisible. But part of the answer is simply Holmes himself. He understood something that law enforcement had not yet put into formal language, that charm is camouflage, that confidence reads as innocence, that the most effective place to hide is directly in front of people who trust you. The World's Fair closed on October 30th, 1893. In its final weeks, an assassin shot and killed the beloved mayor of Chicago in his own home. The White City burned to the ground in a fire the following year, always temporary, always designed to dazzle for one season and no more. The great white buildings that had looked eternal were made of plaster and wood, and they went up fast. 27 million people had walked through those gates. They had seen what human beings could build when they turned all their ingenuity toward beauty and wonder and the future. 1 mile away, a man had been doing something else entirely with his ingenuity. We remember the fair mostly as a moment of extraordinary American optimism. The photographs show crowds of people looking up at white spires, faces open, believing in something. We should also remember what it was like to be Julia Connor, or Emmeline Sigrande, or Pearl, 8 years old, or Alice Pitezel, 15, on a train heading west, believing she was going to see her father. History is made of both things, the wonder and the dark thing beside it, the fair and what was happening 1 mile away. We should be careful, always, about which one we choose to look at.